It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to review the findings of the Stern Review with this distinguished group of panelists. I believe this report shifts the state of the debate and moves the burden of proof toward those economists who judge that very little should be done to stop global warming, at least any early date, because abatement costs exceed the benefits of damage avoided. I think it's high time for such a shift. I will argue that the most important reason for this new conclusion is that it adopts a near-zero rate of pure time preference, the rate at which the future is discounted solely for impatience rather than rising income. This was also the approach that I proposed in my 1992 book on the economics of global warming, and I'm delighted to see that the Stern team has adopted this view. In broad terms, I agree with the Stern report's findings, although I will suggest some important qualifications. My earlier study started with a 300-year horizon because this is the time it will take for the concentrations to begin declining again as the carbon dioxide mixes back into the deep ocean, according to oceanographer Eric Sundquist. With this horizon, I got much higher warming, much higher damages than in the traditional 2 times CO2 benchmarks, and it's absolutely essential to do what the Stern Review has done, is to go beyond those benchmarks to the higher warming, the higher damages. Surprisingly enough, I got damages that ranged very closely to what the Stern Review gets, 5% to 20% of GDP very late in the horizon. And I concluded that with some risk aversion, the benefits of damage avoided would exceed the abatement costs of cutting global emissions from their 1990 rate of about 6 billion tons of carbon to, and that's about 24 billion tons of carbon dioxide, it's important to keep them straight, to a ceiling of about 4 billion tons of carbon indefinitely. That was a cutback of about 80% from the 2100 business as usual baseline. I reached similar conclusions in my more recent Copenhagen Consensus paper about optimal emissions. I found that they should be about a 40% cut from the baseline in the first decade, eventually rising to 60%. That the optimal carbon tax started at about $150 per ton of carbon, that's 45 cents on a gallon of gasoline, $90 for a ton of coal, and rose much higher, although I now think that the version of the DICE model, Bill's model, that I used for that overstated the abatement costs, so they would not have needed to rise so high. Now, by now, it seems that the principal reason for the divergence between essentially 2 schools of results is that in many optimization models, a higher discount rate is used. So let's focus in on the discount rate. The tradition is that the discount rate, or you can call it the social rate of time preference for discounting consumption in the tradition of social cost-benefit analysis pioneered by Arrow, Bradford, Feldstein, equals pure impatience, this rho, which is a pure rate of time preference, plus the growth rate of per capita income multiplied by what's called the elasticity of marginal utility. That says how quickly do you drop off the value of extra consumption as you get richer. If you discounted at something normal like 5%, which economists typically would immediately respond is the right rate, a kind of range, $1 million 200 years from now is worth only $58 today. Well, that's a lot of damage to impose on the future and our descendants in order to have a nice dinner at a restaurant. Even at 1.5%, or 1.5% per year, you'd be willing to pay only $51,000 to avoid $1 million of damage, but at least the future has a chance to be considered. And I agree with the Stern Review that you cannot say, well, let's look at the financial markets, see what these interest rates are, which I think Bill would have us do. The markets don't exist for things 100 years from now. The closest thing we have to the consumption rate of time preference for transferring consumption over time is a risk-free interest rate on U.S. Treasury bills, and that actually does turn out to be about 1 to 1.5%. Now, I also incorporate a shadow price of capital, so indirectly I try to take account of the divergence between the return, but I won't go into the details of that. The zero pure time preference rate, I agree, is that, as Ramsey said, the only ethical value for it is zero. Otherwise, the future doesn't have a chance to participate. Now, the particular way that the Stern Review applied that gets us into some tricky territory. However, as I said, I took a 300-year horizon. What the Stern Review says is look out to the infinite future. Aha. Well, if you have a zero discount rate and you go out to infinity, things really explode. Because how do you discount a time stream? Well, you take the annual rate and you divide it to capitalize to the present value, you divide it by the discount rate. Well, if the discount rate goes almost to zero, then you're going to get almost an infinite result. Now, if you will look at the bottom equation here and look at that right-hand side, what you do, if you divide the total value in the Stern Review's estimates between everything from now to 2200 and everything after 2200, that's the second part of this equation, it turns out that 93% of the action is after 2200. Well, let's think about that. Do we really have a very good feel how we should think about what happens after 2200? As I said, the carbon's supposed to start coming back out of the atmosphere about that time, so maybe some of these damages would reverse. And it's not at all clear to me, in fact, I think it's quite clear, that the review does not say right on the first page, of course, 95% of these effects occur after the end of 200 years, so that's what we're really talking about. Now, that's why you get this puzzle where their damages range from, they start out very low, but by year 200 from now, they're 5 to 20% of GDP, and then we are told that they're 5 to 20% of GDP now and forever. Well, that's because by the time you take the rest of infinity, the first century basically disappears. So, in short, the first major qualification I would make about my view of the study is that it seems to me that by having not chosen a horizon of something like, I prefer 300 years, but maybe 500, 600 years would be better to include taking in the possibility of Greenland ice shelf melting and get some of those effects in, which are on those scales, but not from now to infinity. It seems to me there might be a more useful diagnosis. So this might be an area for additional research. My sense is that they've got a lot of cushion to keep a positive benefit-cost ratio. After all, their benefit-cost ratio is 20 to 1. Or, well, it's more like 13 to 1, because you take the midpoint of 5 to 20% of the benefits, the damage avoided, compare it to 1% of GDP as a cost of abatement. So they've got a lot of cushion to get a somewhat, perhaps more realistic damage estimate by not going from here to infinity. Now, the second question then, and Partha Dasgupta has raised this, was what about that other element, that elasticity of marginal utility? Now, Partha Dasgupta, Bill Nordhaus objected to the study for having pure time preference zero. Partha Dasgupta said, no, that's a very reasonable assumption. Let's set that at zero, but then shouldn't you have a higher drop-off rate in the marginal utility, this elasticity of marginal utility? And he suggested it could be as high as 3 or 4 instead of just unity. And therefore, that would get you right back into the much higher discount rate. Well, as I looked at this, I decided, well, let's infer in the United States what's the elasticity of marginal utility from our tax structure. It will interest you to know that the biblical tithe can be shown to have an elasticity of marginal utility of unity, the Stern value, because each person gives the same percent of their income no matter how rich they are. When I compared the implicit elasticity of marginal utility in the US tax structure, I get something like 1.35, which is close to the 1.5 that I use. If I take Dasgupta's suggested value of 3, then people at incomes of something like $500,000 or $600,000 should be paying a 95% average tax. Well, that's not the values that the society has suggested. So I don't think I would agree with Partha Dasgupta that the elasticity of marginal utility is too low. Now, there's a question of when you should act, and I think Bill has captured this issue of a forced draft immediate reduction to keep the concentrations from rising above 550 parts per million. And there's a tension between that and the classic use of these models, which optimizes over time when you do what? Because it can be more costly to act sooner. My broad sense on this is that at the end of the day, in the insistence on meeting the 550, the study may overstate the kind of carbon tax that is appropriate at the very beginning of the period. It winds up being something like $300 per ton of carbon equivalent. I think it is imperative that we get on a path with something like at least $50 per ton of carbon to send a strong signal, and to also send a signal that this is going to be rising eventually to $125, $150 per ton of carbon. But if you have such a massive initial carbon tax, or at least implied carbon tax, it might fail politically and jeopardize your objective. In conclusion, then, I think that the study broadly is very much on the right track. I think it's high time that the center of gravity in this economic analysis of global warming shift toward the recognition with appropriate discount rates and the benefits of aggressive action warrant the cost of abatement. It seems to me that increasingly economists are recognizing that the dangers in the so-called fat tails of the distributions of probabilities, as Marty Weitzman was emphasizing in his lecture yesterday, warrant taking out insurance against possible damages from climate change. And I think that this study makes a major contribution toward highlighting those dangers. Thank you.
Is this microphone working? Yeah? Okay. It's okay if I sit down then, Minister? Okay. Thank you both very much for the very thoughtful comments. I don't want to take too long in replying. So I'll try to reply first at a rather broad level of where these kinds of models take us, and then comment briefly on some of the specifics of the parameter values. But the reason I want to start with the broad level is that I would be very surprised, indeed deeply worried, if a policymaker thinking about these issues decided that everything turned on whether eta equals 1.1 or 1.7, or very close details on pure time discounting. I think that's why when I presented this morning, I said the first thing to do is to step back and ask yourself, what kinds of risk reductions can you get for an expenditure of around 1% of GDP per annum? And I think that most people would be able to understand that, and they'd be able to look at the risks, and they'd look at the risks in a much more subtle and informed way than is possible in the kind of aggregative models that we build. So I think that's the first way of looking at these things, and I think most people would find that that judgment was relatively easy to make and not in a quite a strong way. So that's the first way to look at it, I think, is in terms of sensible, commonsensical judgments where you compare costs on the one hand and reduced risks on the other, where you can be much more subtle about the reduced risks than you could be in the model. The second thing is to look at what really matters in the statements that come out the other end when you do get into the model, and ask how robust those statements are. What is the statement that really counts? The statement is that the cost of acting strongly now is a lot less than the damage that is saved or averted. We did provide sensitivity analysis in the review. I will give a copy of the review to all the commentators and draw their attention to the postscript It was up on the web about 3 weeks after the publication of the report. It's in the bound version that came out with CUP. And we do indeed do sensitivity analysis to what we call the etas and the deltas. I think it was your theta and rho, Bill. Basically, if you run eta up to 2 or so, a bit more in most of the runs, you're going to get that statement carrying through that the cost of the action to avert the damages is a lot less than the damages averted. If you take a cut-off of 3.5% on the damages in order to say it's a lot more than 1%, then that statement would be pretty robust to a broad variation of the etas and the deltas. So to say that the basic argument turns on the particular eta and delta chosen does not survive the basic sensitivity analysis that we carried out. On the question of, and I said this morning that if the world was left an extern, it would choose an eta above 1. Probably mercifully it's not. And I agree with Bill, if you look at what governments actually do, they don't show signs of a spectacularly high eta. And I gave the example of what the redistributional implications would be for eta equals 2 in a simple-minded way, where we adopt the sort of Okun leaky bucket view of a transfer and saying how much would have to leak out of the bucket for you to still think that transfer is worthwhile. So when we make these consistency tests, we should, as Bill did, ask about consistency with transfer policy if we're talking about an egalitarian parameter. So I think that's an important part of the story. Nonetheless, I would vote for eta higher than 1, and if you do, the results carry through, provided eta's not very high. Actually, because eta's doubling as a risk aversion parameter, if the spreads of the distribution are sufficiently wide, then actually raising eta raises the damages. But that does depend on the spread of the distribution, and it's because eta doubles up as the risk aversion parameter and the inequality parameter. So in the broad sense, I think the perspective which I began with this morning doesn't need the details of etas and deltas. And if you do bring in and you narrow it down to these models and you look at the etas and the deltas, then basic sensitivity analysis leaves the statement that the costs are much less than the damages pretty robust. Now, on some of the, again sticking on the broad issues, the question of peer review. We're having our peer review today, Bill, and that's why I came, that's why I wanted to come. And it's why I believe that public discussion of this is of fundamental importance. The mechanics of government, and I won't go into them here, if you start sharing things with people, this is an observation, not a value judgment now. If you start sharing things with people saying, look, this is the kind of thing we're coming up with, how does that grab you? All my experience is that it's in the papers the next day. And you start having these kinds of discussions, not in this kind of environment. You start having them in the columns of the Daily Mail and the Sun and whatever corresponds to the Daily Mail and the Sun in the United States. So I think there is a problem of combining what I'd love to have and would have loved to have had on this thing with the machinery of government. I don't make any comment about that. I mean, would that it would be different? I'd like it to be different. But it is difficult from inside government to have those kinds of sharings. That's why, as I said, this is happening after the event. But it's fine as long as the discussion takes place, as long as people air their views. And we're not trying to disappear from this. And indeed, that's, as I said before, why we're here. But one or two specifics now. Do we know that long-run market rates of returns are high? Like Bill, I don't know that. And indeed, I would add to the kind of statements that we have to bring into this. If we're thinking the long-run social rates of return on investment, we have to take into account the environmental damages which would take place. And that could reduce your long-run rates of return way below the private rates of return that people see in the market. So I don't think we know over 100, 200 years what these kinds of rates of returns are. But suppose we knew them in the shorter run, and we said we can get high short-run rates of return, so we'll invest in those, we'll put the climate change stuff to one side, we'll make these wonderful rates of returns on these investments that we can see, and we'll sort out climate change later on. And that's the kind of implication of that kind of argument. Would that leave us in a good place? I suspect it wouldn't, and we want to try to build into the models, in this case I would suggest, a very rapidly rising price of environmental goods relative to ordinary goods. And we all know from the basic theory of discounting in models with many capital goods, I mean, following from Malinvaud's famous article in the 1953 Econometrica, and it's pretty well it's obvious anyway, that the unit of account that you use has a very striking effect on the discount rate. If you did your accounting in environmental goods, indeed, the discount rate would probably be negative. So if you build models where you underestimate the rapid rate of rise of the price of environmental goods relative to other goods, then one way of compensating for that mistake is to use a low discount rate. Ideally, what you'd do is to build directly this very rapidly rising price of environmental goods into the model. I suspect people don't, quite honestly. So what worries me is this idea of postponing, getting a thumping great return on your investment and sorting out the environmental problems later ignores that real difficulty of how much more difficult it would be later to spend your money and get yourself out of the environmental pickle that you've got yourself into. And finally, I'd like to say something about what radical means. This morning and this afternoon and tomorrow, I wouldn't place huge emphasis on estimates of the social cost of carbon. They're incredibly sensitive. It's a valuable idea. We can fiddle around with it, but how valuable is it as a guide to policy? If you remember the argument this morning, I said go for a stabilization goal on the basis of risk management and cost of getting there. Think of the paths that are consistent with that stabilization goal. There will be a choice of paths consistent with that stabilization goal. Use the price mechanism to decentralize within that framework and revise from time to time, bearing in mind things like the social cost of carbon. From that point of view, you've got to ask what radical means. I don't measure radical in terms of the social cost of carbon, which is all over the place and very hard to measure, and of course depends very much on your choice of path. And on the path that we had for stabilization, the social cost of carbon started at $35 per ton of CO2 because you were on a more sensible path and not on the business as usual path. So these things are very sensible and sensitive and difficult to get your head around. I would talk about radicalness in policy in terms of the kinds of targets you set yourself for emissions reductions over 20 and 50 years. I would see radical in terms of what will the European Union set itself for an emissions reduction in its third phase of the emissions trading scheme between 2012 and 2020. And we're talking in Europe about 20%, whatever anybody else does, maybe 30% if other people move strongly and we wait in strong anticipation for the United States. That's the kind of way I would measure radical, and you'd ask yourself, how difficult is that to do? What kind of things would we have to do? Is it easier if we start now? And I actually think that starting now is in some ways less radical than starting later. Because if you start now, you can spread your action out over a longer period of time. If you leave it and decide that the stabilization goal of 550 actually was wise, then you get yourself into much more trouble later on. So I would see radical in terms of the kinds of actions you have to take, the kinds of quantitative goals you have to make, the kinds of R&D you try and do now. That's my notion of radical, and I suspect, Bill, that if we looked at that, we probably, radical in those terms, we might actually come up with similar kinds of ideas. So I would not sort of characterize what we did as dramatic in some way. I think the policies that we would describe would look rather similar.